Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Presenting the Medieval World, our 2019 Spring Lecture Series hosted by UNM's Institute for Medieval Studies. My name is Tim Graham. I'm director of the Institute. And let me again fulfill my pleasurable obligation of thanking those whose support has made it possible for us to offer this event. The New Mexico Humanities Council, our donors, the Friends of Medieval Studies, and also the 15 units within UNM that are so generously supporting us. Today, just like yesterday, the bookstore display will be open through the interval between the two lectures and will remain open until shortly after the beginning of the 7:15 lecture. The Medieval Studies Student Association table will be open during the break just outside the doors for you to purchase water and light snacks. Please, at the end of the lecture, take a moment to fill out the New Mexico Humanities Council evaluation form. Drop it on the table outside as you leave. And also, please think about becoming a Friend of Medieval Studies or renewing your membership of the Friends of Medieval Studies. That support has been so extraordinarily helpful to us in enabling us to continue to offer our public programs over the years. This afternoon's speaker, Dr. Raymond Clemens, is the curator of early books and manuscripts at Yale University's Beinecke Library, and my great friend. He received his BA from Oberlin College, his MA from the University of Chicago, and his PhD from Columbia University, where he studied under the legendary Caroline Walker Bynum, who has been described as the most significant medievalist of the last generation. After completing his PhD, he went on to serve as the assistant director and then the acting director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He went on from there to hold a tenured position in the history department at Illinois State University, where he received several teaching awards, including the university's highest recognition for teaching excellence. He also received fellowships from the Mellon Foundation and the British Academy's Scholarly Exchange Program. He moved on to Yale in 2012. He's done great things since he's been there. He has taught a class for the Rare Book School, which is based at the University of Virginia. He's traveled as far afield as Japan, where he arranged for the manuscripts of Japanese collector Toshiyuki Takemiya, who was here at UNM in 2005, to be transferred to the Beinecke's custody. Those are some of the bare facts of his career, but I want to now give this introduction a personal turn. Ray Clemens offered me the greatest opportunity of my professional life when he suggested that we work together on a book that we eventually decided to call Introduction to Manuscript Studies. And this is how that happened. In the summer of 1998, he suggested that I teach an intensive seminar for graduate students at the Newberry Library. I accepted. 6 weeks before the course began, he rang me up and said, "I'd like you to write a short manual for the students." When the course ended, he said, "I'd like us to work together to turn the manual into a book." Over the following 9 years, the book grew and grew and grew as his vision for it developed and became ever more ambitious. The book was finally published in 2007, and it seems to have struck a note. Even today, 11 years later, it continues to sell around 1,000 copies a year. We've had the opportunity to describe our collaboration to public forums on 2 occasions at the annual conference of the Medieval Academy of America and at the International Congress on Medieval Studies in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I can only say that our work together has been by far the best experience I have had of scholarly collaboration, the result of Ray's immense human warmth and great generosity of spirit. I'm profoundly grateful to him. We're going to be hearing about what he's accomplished since he moved to Yale in 2012. The title of his talk to us is Redeeming Forgeries, the Role of Scientific Analysis at the Beinecke Library. Please join me in extending a warm New Mexico welcome to Raymond Clemens.
Hello. I was told to first ask if everyone can hear me. Yes. Okay, great. What will happen, because I'm somewhat blind and wear bifocals, is that I will start to move this way and away from the microphone. So if I do, please stop me or do something physical to let me know that I've lost you. It's interesting that Tim started the way he did. One of the things I wanted to mention after the talk yesterday, when we had the microfilm reader, and I wanted to say that if you are somebody under the age of 50 and you read medieval manuscripts and you like doing it, chances are very good that Tim Graham is the reason why. In 1991, I started reading medieval manuscripts at Columbia University, and no one there could teach me how to read a medieval manuscript. They didn't hire Consuelo Dutschke for several years. So I went to the Newberry Library and I took their famous National Institute for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Humanities 6-week seminar. And because Americans are too stupid to teach paleography, they brought, thank you, this is supposed to be funny, they brought scholars in from Europe, which they did every year. I don't think an American ever taught in that rotation. Part of it was you brought over the real people from Europe. So I spent 6 weeks at the Newberry Library, and you think we would have been up to our ears in manuscripts and working with them. But the fact of the matter is that they brought a big stack of photocopies of microfilm manuscript. And all we did for 6 weeks was page after page of photocopy of microfilm. And what the speaker said last night about not being able to see the whole book, I wouldn't have been able to figure out any of where those scripts came from. Their context, what else was in the book, doodles on the next page. And so in 1993, Timothy Graham offered a course at the Newberry that was just a weekly class. And I thought, I'm frustrated, I want to sit in on it. And what he did was he took us up to the reading room. He had manuscripts on all the tables, he had worksheets, and he made us go through each volume. How was it put together? What are these marks for? How do they work? And I was just passionately in love not only with the manuscripts, but with the way Tim got his students to be able to read them. And they were American, and they were undergraduates and graduate students. And that was why, I'm sorry I only gave you 6 weeks to write the manual, but what I really wanted to do was to encapsulate what Tim had done. That revolution. And now everyone teaches in rare book rooms. I was talking with Annemarie on the way over. At Harvard, they have 300 classes a year. In Houghton, we have 270 in the Beinecke. And almost all of them have this intensive thing. And I think a lot of that was due to Tim and his sort of vision for how this should be. And though, yes, he is European, he does seem to have that unique grasp of how Americans learn and their need for hands-on material. So thank you very much, Tim. As they say in Monty Python, now for something completely different. So one of the things I wanted to do, I'm going to present two really bizarre manuscripts that are in the Beinecke Library. One of those is called the Vinland Map, which we know is a forgery, and the other one is called the Voynich manuscript, which we know is not a forgery, but is very weird anyway, and so we'll be looking at that. The nice thing about the Voynich manuscript is it's written in either a code, cipher, fraud, nobody knows, and it hasn't been solved. So if you're looking for a retirement project, there are slides available online. There's something there for you to do. Before we start, I did want to talk briefly about the Beinecke Library, because before I started there, I didn't know anything about it. If you come to Yale's campus is called pseudo-Gothic, its architecture. It's a bunch of Gothic buildings built in the 1930s. They even have little cement moats to keep the riffraff from New Haven out of the university. This isn't being recorded, is it, Tim? You know, as librarians don't have tenure, don't you? So I'm sorry about that. So this is the building. It looks like a book on its side, and it has this wonderful courtyard, and our offices are along the inside of it, and we get to look out on these marble objects. I've always wanted to roll this one. There's something would be satisfying about that. And this is the Alumni Hall, and was dedicated to World War I veterans. The sculpture garden itself was Asami Nakaguchi, and it's a world-famous sculpture garden, fun to look at. And this is Gordon Bunshaft. He's the architect, looking very 1960s in front of his building. He built mostly skyscrapers, and so this was a really weird building for him. But what's really fascinating about the Beinecke to me is when you go into the building, and it has this amazing book tower that goes up 5 stories and is pure glass, and you can see all of the books. And it's very clear that Bunshaft wanted the library to be a reliquary, a sort of repository where you could come in and see the beauty of the books. He never thought you would touch them. In the 1960s, one didn't. But he wanted you to walk in and be impressed by them. And if you've seen the British Library's book tower, it looks suspiciously like this, but was built in the 2000s, I believe, or the 1990s. We also have what I call a shrine to the Gutenberg Bible. The Gutenberg Bible was not the first printed object. The first printed object is a 9th century Japanese prayer. But they've designed it as what looks to me as a reliquary. So this is the Three Queens reliquary from Cologne Cathedral, and I like the way that they sort of put the Gutenberg as if it were a relic in the center. And if you remember yesterday's talk when they were talking about a book reliquary, and I sort of lost my mind and, well, what was in the reliquary? And this is what sort of sparked that interest. This is what the Beinecke looked like when it first opened. For those of you under 30, archaeologists are still not sure what these big black things are on either side. They think that it was a large database of some sort, and the human in front of it seems to be accessing the database through some sort of wireless technology. But you'll notice his reverential stature, so we think that this was a religious shrine of some sort. And we do have reports that when Harvard shredded their cards after digitizing them, that many people lamented and wailed. So it must have had some deep religious value for the people of the 1960s and 70s, back when it existed. Yale's Sterling Library had these big black boxes as well, and they pulled them out so that students could drink coffee and sit in very comfortable couches. And that's, I'm sure, what's going to happen to the rest of our library at some point. It'll be a very comfortable place to work. And this is the classroom that our renovation opened up. And so this should look familiar to Tim, but this is my class, and it's just like Tim's class. Lots and lots of manuscripts, lots and lots of people getting their hands on them, figuring out what's in there, trying to work out what it's all about. So what do we learn from forgeries? Well, why study forgeries? And there are several different answers to that question. There are historical forgeries that actually contain real historical information. This is a charter from Toshi Takabiya's collection that Tim mentioned. And it is a forged charter. So if you know Anglo-Saxon hands, this one should look scary to you because it was written in the 14th century. It's also written in Old English, a language they would not have used. And the irony of it is that it's actually a forgery of a 13th century charter in the British Library that is itself a forgery of a manuscript that no longer exists, or that probably never existed. And the reason we think they forged this document is that before the 11th century, England had an oral culture. And if you were to give somebody land or give them rights, you did so orally in front of a lot of people, so that everyone was a witness to what it was you had done. By the 12th century, that had shifted to a written culture, where you needed a charter, so that various generations could attest to the fact that you had given this gift. So the original gift, supposedly given by King Edmund, there was no charter for that. But by the 12th century, they needed one. So they forged one. And then later on, they forged a copy of that forged charter. And so this tells us a lot. It tells us a lot about the 14th century, a lot about the 12th century, and a tiny bit about the 11th century, although probably not a great deal. Other objects are more problematic. And the reason I was involved with the Vinland map is that it is a forged map, but for lots of complex reasons, nobody was willing to say that out loud. So I just want to go through a little bit of its history, how it arrived there and what it is. And I think you'll come to see why it is that it's a controversial map. Before we begin, for those of you that don't do medieval maps, so this nice dark map that you see doesn't exist. This is a photoshopped version of it, where they upped the contrast so that you can see the lines. The actual lines really aren't legible, and they don't show up in photographs. So this is a mini forgery. I don't know what to do with that. And the reason it's interesting is that in the 2000s, when I went, not working at the Beinecke, but as a researcher, I went to study it, and they wouldn't let me look at it, at the original. And they said, but we have something better. We have a photograph. And so they showed me this altered photograph. But what my research actually was I researched how maps are made into books. So what I needed to see was the back of this and the sewing to try to find out whether, sorry guys. Screen, right? Screen? Oh, sorry about that. So what I was curious about was, could this have ever been bound into a book? What's fun about looking at this picture, though, is that you can tell, to begin with, that no, it never could have been bound into a book. Because if it was, all this would have been swallowed and gone, right? It would have, it would have been missing. And so this forgery clearly was done on parchment pulled out of a book and then drawn on, and never meant to be bound in a book, which makes no sense. But, so this is Africa down here. This is the Mediterranean, Spain, England, Ireland is its own little island. They didn't do anything with Scotland, sorry. Italy, the little boot kind of going into the thing here. You'll notice that it's pre-1492, so you don't have anything outside of Europe, Africa, and Asia. This is from Ptolemaic maps, 2nd century. What makes this map really weird, and this is what we'll talk about, is two things. It's very obviously an Italian map. And you can tell that because Italy is almost perfectly defined. The Mediterranean, which is what the Italians thought of as the world, is also well defined. And the moment you leave the Mediterranean, you run into England. Does England look like a squat boot? A little bit, maybe. This is Norway, Finland, and Sweden. They don't go that way, and they're not blobs. So that was kind of interesting. This is Iceland. This is Greenland, supposedly. You'll notice it's an island. And then this was supposed to be Newfoundland. And our text here tells us that Leif Erikson got here. And so this is supposed to predate Columbus, and it's proof that, that the Norsemen arrived in America before Columbus. So the book, the map itself, sometime in the 1950s begins to be sold by a bookseller who was later imprisoned for stealing books from the Saragossa Library. And he sold that to a man named Whitten, who was a bookseller in New Haven. New Haven admitted to all sorts of improprieties, and the deal that he had with the other bookseller from Spain was that if he sold the map for more than $3,500, then they would split the difference between them. This is not how booksellers are supposed to operate. And so when it was sold, and nobody really knows what it was sold for, but we speculate around $1 million in the 1960s, they split that windfall. One of the things that Paul Mellon, who was the person that bought it for Yale, insisted on was that it be genuine. And so he had specialists at the Beinecke, not the Beinecke yet, but at Yale and at the British Library validated, and they published this book, the Beinecke, the Vinland Map and the Tartar Relation in 1965, and they go ahead and announce the acquisition of this map. Yale, being the culturally sensitive group that it is, announced this map on Leif Erikson Day, which I know nothing about, but I do know that it's the day before Columbus Day. There were protests in New York City, there were protests in New Haven, because the Italian-American community saw this as Yale trying to put its foot on Columbus, and it claimed that not Italians, but Northern Europeans were the first settlers in North America. The fact of the matter is that 1965, the exact same time that this is announced, there were archaeological digs that had been published in Newfoundland that showed that, in fact, the Norsemen had set up a colony for several years. We don't know why the colony died, wasn't terribly long-lived, so we do know that the Norsemen were here. So that sort of debate doesn't need this map, but the map got featured in it. They then have a closed conference at the Smithsonian. Know that they don't tell you that because this site is about promoting the Vinland map. And people were kind of PO'd that they couldn't just go and hear it. In 1974, a chemist named Walter McCrone uses something called Raman spectrography to look at what elements are in the inks on the map itself. And what he finds is a modern form of titanium called, oh no, I've forgotten the name of it.
Anatase titanium dioxide.
Anatase titanium dioxide, thank you. The interesting thing about this is that this form of anatase does exist in the world around us, but this is a processed form that only exists after 1920, artificial form. So you think that would kind of kill it, and immediately afterwards, as it says here, Yale announces the famous Vinland map may be a forgery. So we think, you know, great, it's done. But it doesn't end. And instead what happens is in 2003, some scientists in Copenhagen reopened the debate, and they say that the anatase is actually there because you can find it in sand. And they said, you know, medieval manuscripts were regularly, they used sand to blot the ink. And whenever you see, all the manuscripts, you don't have sand in them. Haven't you found that? Kind of interesting argument. The moment they made that argument, Yale decided to reprint that 1965 book. And it started this whole controversy all over again where everybody had to beat it down. And so what it left us in, up until a year ago, was this position where a lot of people thought it was genuine, even though we kept telling them it was fake. The reason that's problematic is that it means that really prestigious publications, such as the History of Cartography, which is a multi-volume work that came out of the University of Wisconsin, David Woodward, actually had a little section on the Vinland map because of the possibility that it might be real. And so it was important to us that we figure out, you know, what it was. And I'm just going to walk you through two ways that we looked at this, one historical and one forensic. So we knew back in 1965, before I was born, that that the Vinland map was actually based on an earlier map of Andrea Bianco. This explains why Italy and the Mediterranean are so well developed and the northern colonies, northern states are not. You'll also notice from this that the original map has a very nice round structure, and there's no England looking like a blob, there's no Iceland, there's no Greenland, there's no Newfoundland. So we knew that this was the basic map. 3 years ago, a man named Paul Floyd figured out, not a scholar, just a guy interested in the map, figured out that in fact the Vinland map is not based directly on this map, but it's based on a 1782 engraved copy of the world map. And the way he figured that out is the Vinland map has a lot of weird errors in it, and those errors are found in the engraved copy but not in the original. So he was able to show definitively that, you know, even if you believed in magic, that it couldn't have been before 1782 unless somehow Formilioni was actually basing his map on the Vinland map, which was not possible. So historically, we're pretty strong grounds. There's a lot of other grounds we can bring up, but that's pretty important. The other thing has to do with the way the Greenland and Iceland are depicted. So you'll notice that on Bianco's map there isn't anything. The first map that really shows Greenland is from 1502. And of course, it's Portuguese. The Portuguese were the map makers. They were the people that were exploring the world. And you think about this, this is 10 years after Columbus, but you'll notice that what the Portuguese have here, this is Argentina and Brazil, Cuba and Hispaniola, Florida going up to New York. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. This is Labrador. And it actually, I'll show you a buildup of this in a moment, a close-up, and this is Greenland. So on the close-up, what you can see is that Labrador is the territory of the King of Portugal. And this is Greenland. And you'll notice that Greenland goes into nothing. And that's because until Perry, in the late 19th century, explored Greenland, they thought it was a peninsula because it's covered with ice, and they couldn't get around it. So they assumed that it was a peninsula. And so they don't know until the late 19th century that it's in fact an island. But I really love how this particular map is called the Cantino Planisphere, and he's not Portuguese, he's Italian. And what he did was, the word now is smuggle. He smuggled the map out of Portugal into Italy, because the Italians were competing with the Portuguese. We would say stole, but smuggle is the appropriate academic term for that. And so he gets his name on the map itself. Interestingly, nobody can test the historical information. The things that I just gave you, everybody is willing to say, yeah, that looks awful. But the forensic science is, and that's something I think in question and answer, if you're curious about it, I'd love to talk with you, because it's very interesting to me that that's what gets contested. And so I'll show you some of that. So what we did was repeated some of the tests that Macron did with much more sophisticated tools, and we did some new tests that told us DNA analysis of what the parchment was to try to figure out a little bit more about it. So the parchment analysis of the map. We have an entire center that's devoted to doing research on historical objects. And this is one of our conservators who's using a stereo microscope to look at the map. And this is how we get DNA from maps nowadays. It's an eraser. It's a small eraser, and you just erase a tiny bit of it, and you stick the shavings in an envelope. You send them off to Matthew Collins, and he sends you back your DNA analysis. It's like 23andMe without the swab. But incredible, right? It's not non-destructive, because clearly when you erase, you're getting something of the DNA in there, but it's microscopic. And this is another new way in which science is going to upturn medieval manuscript studies. We also redid the radiocarbon dating. And we did that because nowadays you don't need very much of the manuscript to do that. And we compared it with two other manuscripts that were once bound with the Vinland map. One of these manuscripts was by Vincent de Beauvais. It's called the Speculum Historiale. The other one is called the Tartar Relation. And it's a shorter work. And I think that it was included to sort of make the it's got the idea of travel. And I think that's why it was included. And you'll see that the parchment is almost certainly, from the Vinland map, is the same parchment, from the same era. So the parchment's genuine, and I don't think anyone debated that, but you'd be surprised how many people claimed that we had forged that test. If you go online, what they say is that the test was begun in the 1980s, but it wasn't announced until 2002, because we were hiding something, I guess. I don't know what we get from hiding it, but. This is a little bit weird, but I thought would be fun anyway. So we also decided, well, we could do the DNA analysis. What were the animals? And here we were just trying to see if it was the same animal for all 3 sections. Again, trying to see if this had always been together in one place. And so you can do this DNA analysis to figure out which of the, the 3 animals. We tend not to use pachyderm parchment. It can be done, it's just not ethically, plus it's got those thick hairs in it. This DNA analysis, it seems sort of prosaic. Why do we need to know if it's a goat or a cow or a sheep? But it's actually being reverse engineered now by Matthew Collins and others at Cambridge and York. And what they're doing is they're taking these charters, like the one that you saw at the beginning that was forged. And charters almost always have the exact place where they were composed and the exact date they were composed on them. And so what they're doing is they're using this DNA analysis to determine what various types of cattle and sheep were being bred in different areas, whether they moved, whether the flocks changed, because there's so many, due to hybridization, a lot of flocks died out, their species died out. And so they're reverse engineering this to sort of figure out what these animals were in Europe and where they were, literally on a day-by-day basis, based on this parchment analysis. So we did the ink analysis again, because that was the big one, that the inks had this titanium dioxide in them, and there were sort of other problems that we wanted to account for. The first thing that we did was something called multiple spectral imaging. And this is a technology, this is a technology that allows us to use spectrum outside the visible in order to look at manuscripts. So human beings can see in this very narrow band of light. There's ultraviolet beyond it, near infrared below it, going all the way down to microwaves and X-rays and gamma rays. And what multispectral imaging does is it takes pictures in these areas that we can't see naturally, and it uses a computer to enhance them so that we can see them. And what that allows us to do is see underdrawing and to see things that have been scraped away and get at what is left from a damaged manuscript. So this is a page of the Tartar relation, and you'll notice right here, nothing looks weird. Everything looks completely natural. It's all of a piece. When we did it under ultraviolet, the same thing. It's cloudy, but it's all the same representation. When we did it with infrared, near IR they call it, this happened. We don't know why this happened, but we do know that something is deeply wrong because no scribe is going to suddenly use a new ink for this. So what we think happened, this is on the first page, we think what they were doing was they scraped away a little of the original text and they were starting to practice to see, can we make this look like a medieval document? We're guessing, we don't know. This is, again, we did this 4 months ago. We just haven't published this yet. So we're still working on what was happening. But you'll notice, especially this V, compare it to this V, and how different they look. But again, this is what the infrared gives us, is the ability to see these changes that are invisible to the naked eye. The other thing we did was macro X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And I mentioned Macron. What Macron had was a probe, so it was a single point. And he was able to do different points on the map, but it took a lot of time, and he couldn't do a lot of points. All of them showed essentially the same thing, but people said, well, maybe they got contaminated, maybe there's, he didn't do the whole map. So what we did was, this is a matrix that moves all directions, and we let it run for 2 or 3 days to scan the entire thing, to figure out every drop of pigment that was on this. We did this in microns. And this is us showing that we were conservationally correct. Nobody was hurt. And the way that this technology works is it takes an X-ray, it bounces it off the original, and then you have a detector. And every element has a certain signature that's known and will pop up. This one is titanium, which obviously we were focusing on for a lot of reasons. And you've got, I think, calcium here, zinc here. And it doesn't tell us the amounts. It doesn't tell us ratios. It just tells us that it was present. It's kind of a binary test. And of course, what we found is that there was a tremendous amount of titanium in the map itself. And when we imposed these results over the matrix of the map, it turns out that the only place there's titanium ink is anywhere that there's a line on the map. So I know this looks like Korea at night, but what it is this is not Iceland, this is Newfoundland. And this is the map. And what it's showing you is each place where titanium is. So it's everywhere that there's ink on the map. There will still be people that don't believe, but we did what we can to show that. So just to show you, this is the map, and that's where the titanium was. The second book is the opposite problem. It's a manuscript called the Voynich manuscript. It's appropriate to laugh now. I included this, I got this maybe last week and reposted it on our library's website because I thought it was incredibly creative. I mean, it's not new creative, it's just I like that he put it in graphic form. So I'll briefly show you what the Vinland map is, and maybe you'll see what's happened, but my email is filled every day with many people who have solved the enigma of the Voynich manuscript. And sometimes it's pretty obvious what they're doing. So the first day I got to the Beinecke, a man had solved it, and all he needed was $1 million, and he would share with me the secret. And just to prove his good faith, he sent me what he had translated already, and he said, and it's really odd, it turns out that the Voynich is a love poem, which you're going to see in a moment, it's not. And it read like a Google translation of something, right? It was really psychotic. That turned out to be one of the more normal ones, because at least that person had a rational goal. We had an interesting case where there was a woman who, luckily as a child, had received visions, and that gave her the language of the angels, which is very helpful apparently in reading these sorts of scripts. And she was a bartender in Michigan, and realized that the Voynich was a bartending manual. It showed you how to mix, absinthe and other materials. And she had heard that we were shipping it to Spain, which is not true. It's never left the United States since we've had it. And she came to the library to prevent us. And we had to have guards kind of politely explain, one, that we didn't do it, and two, it's okay to go home. So when things like this happen, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek funny, but it's also kind of, there's a little bit of that out there. So what is the Voynich? The Voynich is 5 different things sort of smashed together. The first part of it looks like what we'd call an herbal or a botanical manual, right? It's got plants in it, lots and lots of plants. And if you look closely, you'll notice that this looks like a Western script. And the longer you look at it, the more it will give you a headache. And what you'll realize eventually is that there's not a single Western character, Roman character in there. It's not Cyrillic, it's not Hebrew, it's not Arabic, it's not anything that we know. People call it Voynichese, which sounds like a cheese, but not what I meant. Voynichese? I'm from New Jersey, we have that problem with language. And it's probably a third of these plants. Now, what's fun about the plants is that it's a plant. So you go out and people say, oh, this is X, and it looks like X. This is one of those. So this is one where somebody thought this is another one that we have in our medical historical library. Looks kind of like this one. I don't think it does, but fine. And it turns out that none of these, according to botanists, are identifiable, and most of them are not, or a good number of them, are not biologically possible, right? That they combine elements, like the flower is fine, but that flower can't go with that kind of stem. So they're ontologically impossible, which means that somebody was having fun, or they were aliens that were doing it. But this is a normal herbal, so you get that they're not so far in form from each other. It also has these star charts in them, astrological drawings that seem to be related to horoscopes. Another huge section is what I call women with ziti, Z-I-T-I, ziti, the pasta. You know pasta, right? Okay, sorry, my first time in New Mexico. But you don't have ziti for Thanksgiving like we do in New Jersey, do you? Didn't think so. So this is a real puzzle. These things, we don't know what these are. These are tunnels, and these are naked women, all women, in water, we think. We don't know why that's there. So, I've heard lovely explanations. My favorite one was somebody who was not Jewish who said, oh, it's clearly women in a mikveh, right, the purification bath. And the idea that a Jew would draw women in a mikveh is kind of funny, but it's like using the blood of Christians in matzah, right? It's fundamentally against the tenets of the religion. The Voynich also has these fold-out charts, which are a lot of fun. So they allow you to, some of them open up this way, some of them open and fold out. And they're stunning in a way. They're really very nice. This is more women in pasta. This is so if you're thinking, well, these are healing baths, and they might be, we just don't know. This is normally what a healing bath looks like. So they did illuminate these, and most of them look like this. You'll notice that there are women here and men up here, and this was normal. They were gender segregated for the baths themselves, for these healing baths. This is Pizzoli in Italy. But again, because we can't read the text, we're not really sure what's happening. There was a English professor in University of Pennsylvania who thought that the whole manual was about reproduction, and that these were, what's the plural of fetuses? Fetuses, feti, fetus? I don't know. But it turned out he was crazy. No, he was literally crazy. He thought that each letter in the Voynich code was a collection of abbreviations in Greek. And you had to unpack all the abbreviations in Greek, translate them into Latin, and then figure out what order they were in. And using this method, his name was Newbolt, he was able to prove that this author did the telescope before Galileo. And that those were fetuses. Another part of this, again, like a medical manual, these are various herbs that are being, we think, ground up. Sorry, I want to do one. And these things are one of the few things that are identifiable. These are like mortar and pestles. These are the things that you would mix up herbs in for medical uses. So we actually have something that sort of grounds us in some sort of reality. If you follow the Voynich manuscript, I forget which one of these is the one that scientists recently thought was, that this was in Nahuatl, the Mesoamerican language, and that it was agave, I think. But he made that up. The last part of the manuscript is what I just call the star recipes. Looks like recipes with these stars on the outside of them that illustrate probably something. So you can see that the manuscript itself is problematic. It's got these illuminations that we don't understand. It's got plants that don't exist. It's got a very odd language. It's got women in baths that don't look like anything else we've seen in another manuscript. So a lot of people have discounted it and said, well, it's a modern forgery. What's interesting about that is that we actually have something sort of rare for the Voynich, which is continuous provenance from the 17th century to today. So this guy, Jacobus Tepenense, was a pharmacist, essentially. And he had the manuscript, and I'll show you in a moment. We can use multispectral imaging to see where his signature was in it. It was later scraped out, so we can't see it anymore. When he died, he gave the manuscript to a man named Barish, and Barish said, this is really confusing, let's get an expert. And so what Barish did was he had his friend write to Marcus Marcy, who again inherited the manuscript, to a man named Athanasius Kircher. And there's a wonderful book about Athanasius Kircher called The Last Man Who Knew Everything. And he was a polymath. I mean, he studied every language, he studied hieroglyphs, he studied all these wonderful things. And he apparently was very smart, although he got hieroglyphs wrong, but still fairly impressive. So what happens is that we have this letter, it still exists. We have other letters that exist in archives in the Vatican that also go from Kircher to Marcy. And what happens is that eventually Marcy sends it to Kircher. This is Kircher, looking stern and Jesuitical, and he's 53. And what happens is that after Kircher dies, he's a Jesuit, and so it stays in his library. And that library carries on until the 19th century, and during the nationalizations of Italy in the 19th century, in 1870, they nationalized private collections. So if you were a religious order and you had manuscripts, they were no longer yours. They now belong to the state of Italy. The only exception to that were manuscripts that people owned privately. So what the Jesuits did was they went through their collections and they picked out all their best stuff, and they said that it was the property. This is a little bookplate of a man named Peter Becks, and this is him. And so all of these books had this bookplate in them, and they weren't nationalized at that time. There was this guy. This is actually Voynich, and I'll show you a picture where he's not quite so exotic looking. Still a little bit exotic looking, but not quite the crazy exotic that he was there. He was a Pole, a resistance fighter who escapes from Poland. He was imprisoned in Poland, makes his way to England, and eventually becomes a bookseller. He moves to the United States, and he's actually the first independent bookseller in the US selling medieval manuscripts. And he sells a ton of them. And almost every big collection has a Voynich manuscript in it. They're just not this Voynich manuscript, but they are one that he bought. And so what happened was that Voynich purchased from the Jesuits this manuscript, several others, brought it back to the States in order to sell it. He does try to sell it. Nobody wants to buy it. And this is one of the great puzzles of the Voynich manuscript. It's a priceless manuscript that nobody's willing to buy. So Voynich dies in the 30s, and he passes the book on to his wife. His wife is Ethel Voynich. She's a famous author in her own right. And she and Voynich's, I won't do air quotes, but Voynich's secretary, Anne Mills, lived together for 40 years. And when Ethel dies, she gives the book to Anne, and Anne then gives it, or doesn't give it, but sells it to H.P. Krauss, the famous bookseller in New York City, sometime in the 60s. We're not sure exactly when. And we don't know what he paid for it. So these are not known. But he did hire Anne Mills, the woman who inherited the book, and writes about her glowingly that she was the most wonderful assistant he ever had. So there's this weird assistant to the bookseller stars kind of a thing. Interestingly, he couldn't sell it either. He lists it for $100,000 in this book catalog of all of his best famous books, but he has no buyers. If you're a medievalist, you can see why. What do you do with that thing? Right? There's no academic study that one can do. So this is my guess, that nobody wanted it for those reasons. Today, my guess is that a .com mogul would sweep it up. And if you're one of those and you'd like to buy this for a small donation to the Beinecke and endowed curatorship, I think that's doable. So Krauss doesn't sell it to the Beinecke either. In 1970, Nixon puts in a new tax law where you can no longer self-identify the value of a manuscript and give it to an institution and take it as a tax write-off. And there's a grace period. And in that grace period, Krauss donates a tremendous number of materials to the Beinecke Library, this baby among them. And so that's how it comes to the Beinecke. It's never been sold, so we don't know its actual market value, one of the things people ask me about. It's been studied, but nobody understands it. So what did we do? It was kind of the opposite of the Vinland map. We needed to find evidence that it wasn't forged. I know that sounds weird, but so many people had thought that Voynich himself had forged it. Even though we had this list of provenance from the 17th century. There are people who've come up to me and said, no, the letters are forged. I'm like, so somebody got into the Vatican archive and got these letters in there. I mean, it's an amazing forgery if you'd done that, but so historically it doesn't work, but so it's forged. So what we did was some of the same tests. Radiocarbon dating in 2009. And I'll show you this in a minute, but it comes back 15th century. There are lots of different pages tested, but again, nothing out of the ordinary. We did the peptide sequencing, which is the DNA analysis, multispectral imaging, and I'll show you a little bit of that. And then we did some UV visible and infrared imaging and more non-destructive ink analysis. And this is the machine that we're using for the spectrography. And unlike the huge one that we needed a matrix, we didn't need this for that because what we were just trying to do was figure out, were these medieval inks or were these modern inks? And unfortunately, it turns out that everything in here is a very common and also cheap and readily available medieval ink. So we were hoping that, we didn't think it'd be 20th century, but we were hoping it'd be something exotic so that we could localize it. And it turns out that the blue, which can be very nice, and lapis lazuli, isn't. It's azurite, which is readily available and extremely cheap. The green was verdigris. I've forgotten what the brown was, but they're all very, very common inks. So there was nothing that helped us localize it using the ink analysis. We did do the multiple spectral imaging, the UV and infrared, and this was interesting because it did allow us, I know this is really hard to read, but there's really, you can see smudges here, and on the UV, you can actually make out Jacobus to Pence here. I know it's difficult to see, but trust me, it's there. And this is this is a book that Jacob Tepenitz owned and also wrote in. And if you can see, it's the same signature. So we were able to actually, we had those letters that did it, and with the multispectral imaging, we're able to show that in fact this was in his library in the 17th century. So some of the other results we had, sorry, the wrong way. I said we did the DNA testing, lots of cow. This is important because we think that they often use goat in Italy, sheep in England, but calf is used everywhere. So again, we were hoping it might at least give us some sort of a clue, but it doesn't. And then these are the various things that we found in the ink. And as you see, all of these are, if you've read Tim's book, the sorts of things you'd expect to find in medieval manuscripts. So it leaves us with this really weird problem, which is that we have a book that we know is a genuine 15th century book. We had lots of people look at the construction of it, look at the binding, look at everything. It's a 15th century book, but we can't read it. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk at some point about why artificial intelligence won't work on it. The short answer is that no medievalist has actually done the paleography to figure out what the individual letter forms are. So if you feed bad data into your system, it's going to chuck out bad data. So actually at the moment, Lisa Fagan-Davis at the Medieval Academy, who's been fascinated by this manuscript forever, is doing that. She's trying to figure out what the individual letter forms are. So maybe that will give us something, but at the moment, probably not. I wanted to end with one other piece, which is part of the fun of being in an archive is that they're, at least in the United States, they're growing, they're changing. So the Beinecke has a robust acquisitions policy. And we do that mostly to buy interesting medieval objects in my area, but obviously I'm a little bit fascinated by forgeries. And so I've actually bought a number of forgeries. It turns out forgeries are cheap. If you saw the news 2 years ago, there were Christie's, the auction house, was auctioning off only the third known set of the the global gores to make up a globe of Waldseemüllers. And this was the first map that showed America on a globe, and the first one that used the word America to describe the continent. And so their initial price was 800 to £1 million was the range for that document. People using the internet were able to see that what had happened was that there was a place where glue was on the manuscript and then print ink on top of the glue, which would mean that you'd first repair the thing and then print on it, which doesn't happen. And they were actually able to figure out that it was a forgery. So Christie's pulls it, and you can't find it online anymore because I tried. It's gone. And then the Beinecke was able to buy it for what I like to say is the mid four figures. And unfortunately, we're having a reputation now as a place of forgery. But this is one that's sort of open, and I leave you with this. So earlier this year, a few months ago, this showed up at an auction site, and unfortunately, this is not the original text. This is an updated text. But the original text said that this was a Maggiolo portolan, and you remember the Portuguese/Italian map that I showed you. That's a type of portolan. And these things are actually really large. It's a single sheet of calf, so about 3 feet long. Did it again, guys, sorry. And they're very collectible. They've been collectible for about 100 years because they look really nice on a wall in a rich person's house, right? You can see this framed and, ooh, look at the pretty European thing. And what it originally said was that it was a 16th century chart by Visconti Maggiolo, and somewhere in here it says that it's the sister map to a portolan in the Beinecke Library. So of course I go crazy and think, oh, that's really neat, but we can't afford it because again, it's going for a huge amount of money. And 2 experts attested that it was a 16th century map. Then they did carbon analysis, and it turns out the parchment's from 1950. So I'm the guy that after you find out it's a forgery, you get a phone call from me that says, are you willing to sell it to me for really little? Some booksellers get really pissed off when you do that because they think you're making fun of them, and I try to explain, no, I want your forgery. So we acquired it, and hasn't gotten to the library yet. But what worries me is this. This is the Beinecke copy. And so we pulled it out, we took a look at it. There are slight differences between the 2 of them, and they're both handmade. These are the only 2 maps attributed to Maggiolo that do not have his name on them. The other problem is that once you think something's a forgery, you start to see it everywhere. So when I pulled this out, these inks, this isn't a great reproduction, they're much more pastel-y than ink should look like in this period. So what we're doing now is we are carbon dating all of the maps in our collection, the portolans. We have about 15 of them. And the question is have a lot of these passed as genuine maps that were made in the 50s and 60s. We don't know if they were intended to be forgeries or if they were just copies for rich people. We don't know exactly what they were. But it's going to start messing up the scholarship because these were all thought to be original. So what's happened is that one fake has now, unfortunately, made us suspicious of all of our other maps. So that's where I leave you. This is the fun of scholarship, is that every day there's something new for us to study, and I appreciate your attention and inviting me here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ray Clemens. And as always, time for questions.
I have a question.
Yeah, over here first.
In the I don't know how to say it, but in the voyage
Great.
folio, did anybody look at whether the handwriting was by one person? And was that shown to be the case, or were there multiple scribes?
So in the case of the Voynich manuscript, is there a single handwriting throughout the manuscript, or is it the work of several scribes?
So first I want to say that I was lied to. I was told this is a general audience, and you're a ringer. That's not the question a general audience asks. So clearly I've been deceived. But I can answer your question because I love paleography, and so I will. And this is based on Lisa Fagan-Davis's work, not my own. But most people agree that the Voynich is done in two separate hands. Again, we're not entirely sure if it's two separate authors or the first author separated by a large gap in time, but whatever it is, there are very distinct letter forms that are different. Not, if you look closely, you can see that they've been made slightly differently. So at least probably two scribes, or one scribe separated by a good degree of time. The other weird thing, though, about the Voynich, I mentioned we did this multispectral imaging, and you saw that when something's erased, it pops up. Almost every medieval manuscript I've ever seen has corrections because it's impossible to copy without making a mistake. And so they would normally scrape it out and write over it. There isn't a single scraping that we found in this. So it might be a miraculous manuscript in more ways than one. We're not sure. But your question about the hands is brilliant. I like that.
Yeah.
So, off the record, do you have a personal theory about this Voynich manuscript?
Do you have your own personal theory about the Voynich manuscript?
So you promise you won't email me? Believe it or not, I do. Because it's clearly a 15th century manuscript. I don't think it's a code for anything. I think somebody put together what they thought would look like a healing manual, written in a secret code, probably to sell to a rich person. It's not that I don't like rich people, it's just that they have money. And so I think that was his intended audience. And so that's my guess, that it wasn't meant to be a cipher. But if Lisa Fagan-Davis figures out this script and it goes to artificial intelligence, I might be wrong. But that's my personal theory. I think somebody made it to fool somebody else. The idea, though, that I best love, well, I love the alien one. There's several people that thought it was like an alien journal of a young girl, and then she forgets it when she leaves. I'm on with that. I love that. But there, sort of a more serious one is that there's that there might be sort of alchemical things in there as well. And we did have an alchemical specialist looked at it, and she couldn't find anything sort of specific to that. But we're not sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned that after the introduction of these types of documents, as you call these maps on Cascan, that you've been forced to sort of go back and reevaluate what you currently have. Is there a move at this point with other libraries that are saying, hey, we need to be checking this sort of up front, or we need to go back, and after having it checked, is that sort of being added into database fields that are associated with the item itself in the databases that are accessible by researchers and things?
So you mentioned that at the Beinecke, you've been reevaluating the books that you have to check if they're forgeries or not. Has this been going on in other libraries? And if it has, and if books have been demonstrated not to be genuinely from the period they purport to be, has that information been added to databases that are available to researchers?
So can I ask if you asked that in a cynical manner or a genuine? Okay, no, I just ask. It's a great question. The problem is, as you can see from the resale prices, these things are extremely expensive. The Vinland map, for example, $1 million in 1960s. Just a huge amount of money. And Yale puts all of its reputation behind it. It prints this wrong book twice. And so the last thing in the world Yale wants to do is more tests on it and publish information about it. In fact, and this is negligence on my part, but we haven't updated the online catalog with a lot of this information. We're not trying to be duplicitous, we're just lazy or doing other things. So the fact of the matter is that most of this testing gets done before an object comes in nowadays. And I don't know of any other group that's going back and looking at the Portland specifically, because I don't think most people realize that there was a market for modern Portland maps. We actually have several, and they're fairly obviously fakes. They're small and they're kind of bizarre looking. So the first part of your question is for the most part, it's not in the library's best interest to figure out that things that people paid a lot of money for are in fact not worth anything. In fact, when we lent the Vinland map to Mystic Seaport, and whenever we lend something, we need to do an insurance evaluation. And I evaluated it, what I thought a forged map, what I would pay for it. And the director of my library came back and he said, "You can't do that." And I said, "This is sort of a market value." And I showed 3 other things that were, and he said, "But it's the Vinland map. Doesn't it have some sort of value as a famous forgery?" But that's, you can see, there's that impulse to sort of protect your collections, to make sure that they're genuine. The second thing is that this testing used to be destructive. So Cheryl Porter is a famous ink pigments analyst, and she has a wonderful slide where she wants to ask a chemist to take a little bit of pigment from each of these illuminated initials in an inconspicuous spot. And the photograph is of this like 1 centimeter square in the center of the illumination, right? Because to a scientist, none of it's consequential, so he just wanted the stuff. So it used to be destructive, and so that was a big barrier. At the moment, the barrier is often cost. That equipment is extremely expensive, and we got it through grants that were doing other projects, and then we sort of inherited it. In terms of information about that, I don't think it's intentional. It's just that if you look at most records at most libraries, they're not really up to date. Harvard is different; they're better. But I will actually go online and look at something and think, "Oh no," and so I don't think that's duplicitous. I honestly think it's just a matter of record keeping. But it doesn't. For example, like I've yelled at everyone that Vinland's fake, and it still keeps popping up as, "Oh, it's possibly real." Did I answer your question?
Any last question before we take a break? Yes.
To your speculation that the Beinecke manuscript was deceptively intended at the time it was made, do you know other examples of allegedly magical or alchemical texts that are in fact nonsense?
So, do you know of any other magical or alchemical texts that actually prove to be nonsense?
No. So my theory has a huge weakness, which is I don't have any other examples that do that. There are examples of John Dee in the 16th century, and Deborah Harkness has discovered these, and then another person did the code. He actually wrote a book in code that was supposed to be sort of scientific but holy book as well. A fairly simple code, and people had thought he had done this and it was lost, and then a few years ago Deborah Harkness discovered those, and a famous cryptologist broke it, and it did turn out to be this sort of a spiritual thing of some sort. But for the most part, we do have some alchemical materials that are written in ciphers, but the ciphers are very easily broken. They tend to be letter ciphers where one letter is substituted for another, and so given enough time, it's usually pretty able to crack, and I can show you lots and lots of those. But a manuscript, but that I don't think was done to deceive, that was to hide illicit information. Alchemy could get you burned. In fact, Louisa Burnham is working on a book about an alchemist that was tried as a heretic, not as a scientist. So that might be a reason for it, but I don't honestly know of another piece like that that was written to deceive in that same way.
2 or 3 years ago, my wife played the best possible April Fool on me. A few months before that, there was a Russian, Alex Ulyanenko, who wrote both to Ray and to me, claiming to have solved the code of the Voynich manuscript. I happened to mention it to my wife. For some reason, she displayed unusual interest. 31st of March following, the history department gets a call from somebody claiming to be this Russian, saying that he was in Washington, D.C. for a conference. He was coming to Albuquerque the next day to see me. What she'd done is that she had got a friend of ours who is an actor, and who formerly was a diplomat who served in the American embassy in Moscow, to call the history department pretending to be this guy. So, tribute to my wife for the best ever April Fool. We'll take a break now. Please come join us for the 7:15 lecture about Boston's Byzantine Madonna, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and medieval art. Let's give Ray Clemens a great send-off for a wonderful lecture.